Hello and welcome to the fifth talk of our Wonder Kids series. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sav and I'm research manager in the Early Development Research Group here at UBC. And also helping us today is Portia, very talented Portia, who recently joined our team as our EDRG recruitment coordinator. Speaking to us today is Dr. Darko Odic, who, along with his wonderful team of trainees at the Center for Cognitive Development, studies how children represent and reason about numbers, time, and space, and how such reasoning interacts with higher level abilities like language and mathematics. Dr. Odic's Center for Cognitive Development is one of 7 research centers that make up the Early Development Research Group. Because most of the research that Dr. Odic will tell us about today took place on campus at the University of British Columbia, I would like to acknowledge that our campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Of course, this is a virtual event, and I would like to acknowledge as well the traditional owners and caretakers of the many lands that you may be joining us from, both near and far. I will introduce Dr. Odic in just a moment, and he will speak for about 30 minutes or so. And then afterwards, he will answer your questions, taking us to about 2 o'clock. Do feel free to pop in and out as you need. We understand that many of you have little ones at home. To gather your questions during or after the talk, you can enter them anytime as they come to mind. You may access the Q&A button along the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit questions there either with your name or anonymously, and you can also upvote questions from others that you would like to have answered. If you're unable to stay for the entire talk or experience some technical issues, don't worry, we will be posting this recording onto the EDRG website events page. Okay, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Darko Odic to you today, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychology at UBC. Darko joined us in the Early Development Research Group back in 2014, immediately after completing his PhD in psychology at Johns Hopkins University. His research on how children learn about the world around them, including explorations of the origin of language and thought, is award-winning. So far, his innovative work has been acknowledged with the Johns Hopkins G. Stanley Hall Excellence in Research Award, that's a mouthful, and the Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science. Darko is also known for excellence in teaching, and indeed, his courses are a favorite among the psychology and cognitive science students here at UBC. He has been awarded the Robert E. Knox Master Teaching Award, and I'm sure his talents in this area will be obvious as he presents some of his research to us today, but no pressure implied there, Darko. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Darko Odic.
Thanks so much, Sav, and thank you for joining us today. I know it's a beautiful Vancouver sunny day outside, so thanks for choosing to spend at least a portion of your Saturday with us here. So today I am going to be telling you a little bit about what babies and young children know about numbers. And to begin, I really want you to consider a slightly different question at first, and that is, what do you think about when you think about math? And I think for most of us, there is a lot that, the thought about mathematics brings up. For many of us, maybe the first thing we think about when we think about mathematics is this very complicated, abstract space. Maybe it reminds you of, taking math in school and all the many standardized tests you've done, things like multiplication tables or doing long division. Maybe for some of you, math makes you think about how it is a kind of a crowning pinnacle of human achievement. Very often, people who are tremendously successful, able mathematicians are considered geniuses in the area of human thought. Or maybe you, like me, don't really like to think about math very much. Maybe math is something that makes you a little bit anxious. Maybe math is something that wasn't really your favorite thing in school. I can certainly say it was not one of mine. Maybe math instead is something that you'd like to think as little about, except when you have to, when it comes time to do your taxes, or, if you're ever, forced to calculate tip at a restaurant or something like that. So as adults, we tend to have a lot of different experiences, a lot of different conceptualizations of math, what mathematics is, and we use it in many different contexts in our day-to-day life. But I want to now turn to the question of, what do babies and young children who are maybe 3, 4, 5 years of age, who've not had any formal schooling whatsoever, what do they think about math? And usually, whereas the space of what all of us think about math is really quite big and large, for most of us, I think when you consider this question, you kind of arrive at one of two likely answers. It's either that babies and young children don't think about math very much at all, or maybe if they know anything, it's really, really simple things, right? Very simple intuitions like 1 and 1 is 2. And really, that is a kind of a cultural assumption that most of us hold. Math is, after all, something that takes an extraordinarily long time to learn in school. It is something that kids very classically can be seen to struggle with. Even children who do quite well in math seem to have an uneven path in achieving it. And many people, even as adults, continue to struggle with math. So it seems quite intuitive that young children begin as blank slates when it comes to mathematics. And then math is something that must be acquired slowly with a lot of discipline and effort and trial and error. Now, today, I want to try and convince you of 3 things. And I want to dispel some of these myths that developmental psychology has taught us are actually very far from the truth. So in today's talk, I want to try and convince you of 3 things. 1, that babies and young children do actually have extremely rich intuitions about math, that they have a very complex, what we call number sense. And I'll define what I mean by that in just a second. 2, that this number sense is actually foundational and critically important in how children acquire more advanced math abilities. It helps children learn some of their earliest abilities in math in early schooling, and maybe continues to play a role even amongst us as adults. And 3, I want to tell you that this number sense is not something that is static, and instead is something that we can foster, and we can help children foster their number sense through play and exploration, ultimately really helping them with some of their early mathematical abilities, far more than you might think if you think that children are just born as blank slates when it comes to math and number. Okay, so in the first part of today's talk, and what's really going to be the longest, I want to really spend time convincing you that children have a very rich number sense. And to do this, I really don't want to tell you what this is. Instead, I'd love to show it to you. Because as you will learn, it's not just kids who have it, it's all of us as well. The number sense in psychology is theorized to be an evolutionarily ancient system that is present in all of us in order to allow us to very quickly but imprecisely estimate the number of various things in our world. Many psychologists believe that the number sense evolved for the purpose of helping our ancestors forage for food, maybe being able to very quickly decide that, there are more berries in this bush or that one, or to quickly assess threats, like whether an incoming band of, marauding predators or something like that is something that you need to flee or fight. But of course, when we study the number sense today, we don't really, we don't expose anybody to any kind of a predator. And instead, we can demonstrate the presence of a number sense through a very simple demo. What I'm going to do in just a moment is very, very briefly, just for less than a second, flash some blue and yellow dots for you on the screen. And all I want you to do is just very quickly decide whether you think there are more blue dots or more yellow dots. And, if we were all together in an auditorium, I'd ask you all to sort of like yell it out loud, but for all intents and purposes, you can just think to yourself what you think the answer is. So here's the first one we'll try. So here it goes. You saw very, very quickly, you probably were able to tell that there were more blue dots on that one. Here's another one. And most of you probably could tell, probably more yellow. And here's the final one. And that one's much harder, as you can probably tell. And the answer in that one, by the way, was yellow. And what I want you to notice from this very quick example is 2 very important things. One, you can do this without any counting or anything like that. You could very quickly visually assess the rough number of items in the scene and very quickly compare them. But the other important thing that you should have noticed is that it's not always so easy. As the number between these 2 sets, between the blue and yellow dots, becomes closer and closer together in number, it becomes harder and harder to tell them apart. And this is because although you have this automatic, intuitive ability to quickly assess the number of items in a scene without counting, it is only an approximate sense of number. So the number sense is exactly this immediate, readily accessible, fast, but only approximate sense of number. Now, as it turns out, this is not something that you have only because you're an educated, experienced adult. We find evidence of the number sense even in newborn babies, in preschool-age children, and even in cultures such as the Brazilian Piraha, who lack number words altogether in their language. Now, a lot of the time when I tell this to parents, they sort of ask, well, how could you ever tell that a newborn baby or somebody who doesn't have number words has a number sense? And I want to give you a brief flavor for how we test this in the lab, including my own, in order to really convince you that these are things we really think we know reliably. When we work with newborns, for example, very often what we might do is take a newborn and play a sequence of tones, like 4 times the sound ta, like ta, 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 ta. And we present them with these 2 visual arrays. And what we find is that even newborns match the number of tones that they hear to the number of objects that they see. If you play 4 tones, they will spend most of their time looking at this side. And if you play 12, they will look much more at that one. With preschoolers, we can much more readily do tasks, just like you just saw. In many tasks in my lab, we bring preschoolers into the lab, we show them displays of blue and yellow dots and simply ask them which side has more. And without using any number words or anything like that, they readily, though approximately again, can identify this. With the Piraha, much of the cross-cultural work, because the Piraha lack number words, instead works by number matching, presenting them with a sequence of dots and then asking them to, for example, pull out a number of matching balloons or something like that, in which case they can demonstrate that even though they don't have a number word for something like 15, if we show them 15 dots, they will pull out approximately 15 of these balloons. Now, ultimately, as it turns out, because of its evolutionary origin, the number sense is not even exclusive to humans. We find it in other primates, for example. In this case, many of the labs, my lab does not work with primates, but many of the labs that do, train primates to, for example, look at 2 displays of dots, and by selecting the one that has more dots, they get a little bit of a reward. And you can find very, very quickly with minimal training that primates, including apes and monkeys, can do this task. We actually even find a number sense in dogs and puppies. Many of the emerging work in comparative cognition brings dogs into the lab and tests, for example, by showing them simple displays like these and very quickly training them that they need to go to the side that has more to get a little treat. And your doggo at home too would, with appropriate training, very easily be able to approximately tell numbers apart. And finally, and I think most mind-blowingly, at least to me, we've even found evidence of number sense in insects like bees. This is actually one of my all-time favorite studies in all of psychology. In this particular task, bees are trained that there's a flower with some nectar. They need to fly through this little hole that has a particular object here, and they're trained that whatever number they see here, they need to go 2 higher than that. And in this case, the bee will learn to fly through this, and if there's a 1, to then go through this 3. You can also actually teach them to subtract as well. And bees can, with very minimal training, demonstrate the ability to not only estimate the number of squares, but also approximately add and subtract. Now, this number sense is ultimately not only used for estimating number. And just like bees can do some kind of mathematical operations with it, it turns out that human children and babies can as well. And again, we can demonstrate this with a very simple little demo. What we do in the lab is we might show a little box. It would be a physical one rather than on the screen. Some dots might appear, and we might hide them behind the box, not allowing anybody to count. Some number of dots would then leave. This is a kind of a subtraction task. And we would ask the child whether or not the remaining number of dots is too many or too few. And if you were paying attention, you could tell this is probably too many dots, given how many initially entered and exited. So the number sense can even be used to guide a rough sense of addition and subtraction. Maybe you think that addition and subtraction isn't that impressive. In most recent work, including work done in my lab by some of my students, we've actually extended the range of mathematical operations that the number sense can do. And we find that the number sense even allows 5-year-olds who've never had any formal schooling on the topic to intuitively multiply and divide. And here I want to show you a little bit more detail because this is a study that we're extremely excited about. If you've ever actually participated with your children in my particular lab, there's actually a chance that your child has participated in this task. So I want to show you a little bit more details on how we do this. In a typical task when we're assessing children's number sense, besides showing them blue and yellow dots and asking them to compare which side has more, another very typical thing we do is we show them an array of dots like this. And we tell them that this, for example, a single dot is called a modi. And we can then ask them very simple questions like, well, how many modis do you see over here? Now, this is not at all a multiplication or a division task. This is a simple little task in which children just need to give us a number word that matches the number that they estimate in here. Kids wouldn't see this for more than a couple of seconds, so they couldn't count. And 5-year-olds can do this. So for example, I'm not going to show you very many graphs and a lot of data today, but I want to guide you through this because it's going to be important for the very next point. If we plot, for example, the number of dots that we show to a typical 5-year-old, we can ask what on average do they say when they see 5 dots or 9 dots or 15 or 21. And what we find is that a typical 5-year-old is quite good at this task, even without any kind of counting. They can attach number words to their number sense, and they will on average tell you just about 5 for 5, just about 10 for 9, etc. But here is what one of my graduate students, Denny, very cleverly thought about in order to push this into testing their multiplication and division. Rather than presenting kids with just a single dot, Denny instead presented them with 3 dots that she called a modi. And so now children are shown 3 dots, but told to consider it as a single unit. This is a modi, even though it's comprised of 3 of them. Now, what's really interesting is that now we can present children with collections of 15 dots, 24 dots, 39 dots, 63 dots. And if a child does not understand anything about multiplication or division, then what they should do really is they should say 15 for 15, 24 for 24, etc., mapped approximately by this pink line. But if 5-year-olds actually understand the concept of division, then because they know that a single modi is 3, when they see 15 dots and we ask them how many modis, they should instead say 5 or about there. And for 63, they should say 21, etc. So which one do 5-year-olds do? 5-year-olds show robust evidence of being able to intuitively divide. And even some of our 5-year-olds, when shown 63 dots, if asked how many modis, will say 21. And to me, this is a really powerful demonstration of the way in which the intuitive number sense can be mobilized to demonstrate that even preschool age children nevertheless have very rich intuitions about mathematical operations. And I think finally, the final experiment in this first part that I'll tell you about is that these different skills can all be brought together to do something even more advanced. And that is solve for unknown variables, something that in school, children really don't get introduced until grade 3 and 4, sometimes later, depending on the curriculum as well. So I'll show you how we've demonstrated that children can intuitively solve for unknown variables. We introduce kids to a little plush gator, and we say gator has a very magical cup. And this magical cup is always going to do something special to a pile of buttons. And what we demonstrate to the children is we show them, here's a pile of buttons. Let's say that there are 10 of them. The magic cup covers them up, comes back up, and now there's way fewer buttons. And in fact, what we can do, for example, is we can make this magical cup always subtract 5 buttons. What we do is we show this to kids over and over again. We show them, look, there were 10, now there's 5. There were 15, now there's 10, etc. And after a couple of trials of showing them that this magic cup consistently does -5, we drop the cup and we say, oops, Gator just lost this cup. Oh no, there are 2 different cups. And we bring out another solo cup. And we demonstrate that while one of these cups is doing Gator's old transformation of -5. Another one is maybe subtracting by 10. And children are asked on the basis of seeing this transformation, which one of these cups is Gator's? Now, when you think about it, this task has everything that ultimately we're interested in when kids are being asked to, for example, solve for X. Children need to surmise that there's a hidden property that they were never told about, that there's a particular cup, that X in this case, that constantly changes it by a particular operation, -5. And kids can not only solve that this cup is not just subtracting, but subtracting by exactly 5, because when we ask them to identify which one of these two cups is Gator's, they know that it's this one. So this experiment very wonderfully shows how kids can bring together their number sense to even do some very fancy looking things like solving for an unknown variable. So I hope that with this little glance into some of the work that my lab and other labs have done, I've convinced you thus far that babies do have a rich number sense. It is intuitive, it is approximate, but ultimately it's there. Now I want to turn to the second part of the talk and tell you that this intuitive number sense is not just something that we use in a pinch when someone's asking us to estimate a number of jelly beans or something like that, or when you're trying to estimate the number of items in your shopping cart or something like that. But that instead, the number sense helps children learn early math skills. Now, this is a very important qualifier, and I want to make sure to really emphasize this. When we're talking about the role of the number sense in children's math learning, we don't believe that it contributes to every facet of mathematics. And research is really focused on how the number sense provides a foundation for children's earliest mathematical skills, rather than, for example, playing a role in how children understand something like imaginary numbers or something like that. So when I am talking about early math skills, I want to be very precise here, because as it turns out, we think that the number sense contributes to things like counting, children's ability to count and understand what's known as cardinality, that the last number that they counted to is the number of the set. The number sense is thought to help with children's ability to recognize number and to understand concepts like more or less, to understand that the number word 6 is more than the number word 3. To match number to tokens in that kind of same sense as those yellow dots that I was showing you earlier. To do simple addition and subtraction, and to solve very simple word problems. So this is going to be the set of things that psychologists like me and many others who study the number sense believe that the number sense is really contributing to. So how can we demonstrate this? Well, before I answer that question, there's another fact that's really important about the number sense. And that is, while we all have it, we all also vary in how good our number sense is. You can think by analogy something like your eyesight. All of us, well, with few exceptions, are born with the ability to see. But not all of us have equivalently good eyesight. And in that same way, while all of us are born with an intuitive number sense, some of us have a number sense that's a little bit better than others. The way in which we figure out how good is an individual person's number sense is through the following method. When I showed you previously those blue and yellow dots, I noted that as the number between them gets closer and closer, it becomes harder and harder to tell which side has more. This is what we would call a ratio of 2 to 1. There's twice as many yellow as blue dots. Even 6-month-old infants can actually, with appropriate testing, figure out that it's the yellow side that has more. But we can, of course, make this ratio harder and harder. Here's a ratio of only 50%, 18 to 12 dots, or this one right here. And at some point, you might start to figure out that, oh boy, I'm having quite a bit more difficulty telling which side has more. For me, by the way, that's right here. Despite studying the number sense for well over 15 years now, I can tell you my number sense is actually not that great. Study what you can't do. And this is usually where it caps out for me. But there are people who can actually even tell a difference of something like 16 to 14 dots. The important part here is that by showing children or adults different ratios, we can try slowly to figure out what is the hardest or the lowest ratio that you can reliably tell apart. Just like an eye doctor might ask, what is the smallest letter that you can reliably tell apart? Now, I know you might be instantly curious, how good is your number sense? And luckily, psychologists have developed a set of free tools where you can go online and do a very brief number sense assessment. You can go to panamath.org. I will note that this is a free piece of software that was developed by my graduate advisor. So full conflict of interest there, though none of us are making any kind of money on it. It's completely free, but you're welcome to go to this website. You can test yourself, you can test your kids, and in order to figure out just how good your individual number sense is. And here is the kicker. How good your number sense is turns out to predict those early math skills that I was talking about before. So if we take little 5, 6, 7-year-old children and we give them a standardized test of early mathematical abilities, things like counting, simple addition and subtraction, matching numbers to tokens, and we also figure out how good is their number sense, we find a robust correlation between them. So in this particular graph, again, I'm not going to show many graphs, but just to give you some sense of this, each one of these points is an individual child. On this axis, we have their math score, higher is better. And on this one, we have their number sense precision, lower is better because they can tell a smaller ratio. And what you can tell is that in general, kids who do better on the formal math assessment also tend to have a better number sense. For those of you who care about, well, how good of a predictor is it? It explains about 30% of the variability. That means that the number sense, by the way, is not the primary nor the only predictor of early math ability. And there is not a single psychologist I know who believes that, the number sense matters more than anything else. In fact, we know, as I will tell you in just a little bit, that we can foster and change the number sense and make it better. But nevertheless, there is a robust relationship here. Another very important finding in the literature is that there is also a predictive relationship between the quality of one's number sense and how much children struggle with mathematics. So what we have found, for example, is the children who have math-specific learning disabilities, so children who really selectively struggle in math, have a much worse number sense than children who are typically achieving, and the children who are especially high achieving in math, children who are gifted in early mathematical abilities, turn out to have an especially good number sense. Again, lower is better because of that ability to tell a smaller ratio. Now, ultimately, however, everything I've shown you so far is just a correlation. It just tells us that we can predict something about early mathematics from your number sense, but it doesn't tell us why. And so the biggest question, really, the million-dollar question is, why does this relationship exist? In what way does the number sense contribute to early mathematical abilities? And here, I have to unfortunately disappoint you, because the short answer is that we don't know. It is one of the biggest questions that every single lab studying the number sense is wrestling with. There's a lot of research, including in my lab, that is trying to figure out this mechanism that actually supports the link between the intuitive number sense and these early mathematical skills. But I don't want to leave you completely disappointed. I'll tell you our working set of hypotheses. And I think that the research is broadly starting to coalesce around these. One important factor where we think the number sense matters a lot is in helping drive attention towards numbers. Children who have a better number sense tend to notice number more in their everyday life. They tend to talk a little bit more about number. They tend to more intuitively think about numbers and intuitive addition and subtraction. And as a result of that, we think that children who are simply paying more attention to number, they're more engaged with these concepts. And when they start learning them in schools, they're sort of recognizable. They're things that they've already been thinking about in their day-to-day life. Another very important factor is that, especially for these concepts like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, where there is an intuitive basis in the approximate intuitive number sense, well, these concepts may be much more rapidly acquired if children recognize that link. I always like to take the analogy of language learning. If you are learning a brand new language, it helps a lot to know how to translate particular words between that language and the language that you're trying to learn. In the same way, the approximate number system, this intuitive number sense, is a kind of intuitive language. And if children recognize the link between some of the things that it can do and these like weird squiggles on a page like pluses and multiplication symbols, then they can much more readily recognize what these things are and take some of these intuitions and bring them into the classroom. And the final component where we think the intuitive number sense really matters a lot is in helping kids catch errors. The intuitive number sense is, everybody agrees, way too imprecise to be a kind of a mental calculator. Trust me, if you try doing your taxes just with your intuitive number sense, you would definitely get into trouble with the government. But nevertheless, where it is potentially quite handy is in very quickly helping catch things that are just unreasonable answers. And if you've ever had the experience of maybe, having to calculate tip by hand at a restaurant and sort of sitting back and being like, oh, that just seems like way too much or way too little, it's very likely that what happened there is you carried out an intuitive estimate of where the answer should be. And then when you arrived at it one more formally, it was sort of something seemed off. So these are the mechanisms that we're actively exploring. A lot of our research that you yourself can get involved with in our lab is really trying to understand these factors. So while we don't yet know how, we do know that the number sense ultimately does predict these early school math abilities. Well, okay then. Then the last thing we want to know is, what can we do to foster it? And what I really want to encourage you is, as much as possible, to understand that the way to foster children's number sense is by embracing its approximate and readily available nature. The fact that any given moment, your child is thinking about numbers by looking around their world. The sense of number is approximate, and that is okay. We can facilitate its nature. One thing that a lot of researchers are doing right now is creating interventions in which parents are simply encouraged to point out number in the day-to-day world, not by asking their kids necessarily to count, but simply by pointing out, walking through the park and asking their kids, do you think that there are more trees or flowers here or something like that? That's going to allow children to pay more attention to their intuitive number sense and might help them later when they're starting to use it much more readily in school. Another important aspect is this prediction component. A lot of the time in schooling, children are really encouraged to think about just one right answer. And a lot of our math, especially the formal kind, is about teaching kids these highly regimented procedures for how to end up with just one right answer. But the number sense doesn't work like that. And ultimately, a lot of psychologists believe that we're really, by overly emphasizing the need for a single right answer, we're ultimately pulling away math from children's rich intuitions, making it a completely foreign system for them to learn, where we could really be relying on it to do some of the heavy lifting itself. So rather than focusing too much on a single right answer, children should be allowed to make predictions, and not just, a single prediction, sort of like any one of these might be okay. And along with that, in order to emphasize the approximate role of the number sense, we shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes. If the number sense is not about one right answer, but by being sort of like in the ballpark of it, children's intuitions about what things like multiplication and addition are still going to be very powerfully harnessed. Now, all of this is very abstract, and I want to give you just one more aspect of this fostering nature that I think has really been shown by researchers to be an actual powerful intervention for helping kids. And this is math talk, talking about math at home. When you think about it, math talk ultimately brings all of these things together. Talking about numbers, talking about math, doing simple little games of addition and subtraction, asking kids to make prediction, hiding some blocks, behind a screen and then, asking them to predict what's behind it is exactly the kind of thing that is going to, immerse children into this exploratory domain of mathematics where they can actually start playing with it a lot more. And a major predictor as a result of that is more general math talk. Now, many parents, out of a either belief that their kids don't have any conceptions about math, or out of a fear of making sure not to push their kids into doing something wrong with math, very often avoid math talk at home. But contrary to this, what researchers have found is that the more math talk we do with our kids, the better and more engaged with mathematics, both the intuitive and the school kind, they end up being. One very specific bit of software that has been developed for this is a piece of software called Bedtime Math. And again, I want to make sure no conflicts of interest here. I've had nothing to do with the development of this. It's just a piece of software that psychologists have studied and found to be highly efficacious at raising the general propensity for math talk. Bedtime Math is a free application developed by researchers at the University of Chicago, some of my colleagues there. And what it does is it tries to create a sequence of stories through which parents can, usually before bedtime, read to their kids in order to increase the amount of math talk that they're engaging with. All of these things like making predictions, paying more attention to numbers, etc. And again, one of the reasons why I highlighted this as a potential way to foster is because research has shown that it works. Researchers from the University of Chicago have found that by increasing the weekly usage of an app such as this one, and by the way, it doesn't have to be this one, anything that raises math talk is a good thing. The children's growth in math achievement throughout a school year gets higher and higher. I also want to highlight something else really important about this graph, and that is the difference between what we call low and high math anxious parents. Math anxiety is a real thing. And math anxiety impacts parents all the time. Many of us have grown up in a system where we learned math in what I think is a pretty disastrous way, and that makes all of us quite anxious about mathematics. And as a result of that, math anxious parents tend to avoid talking to their kids about math because it's not something that makes them feel particularly good. But what these kinds of applications allow is to create this sort of safer environment in which even parents who are relatively high anxious can, with the engagement, raise the level of math talk in their house and help foster the number sense and early mathematical abilities with their kids. All right, so I hope that I've now done at least a little bit to convince you that not only kids have a rich number sense, and not only do we find that it helps in ways that we're still researching them in helping with early math skills, we can also foster it by engaging in more math talk and embracing the approximate and readily available nature of the intuitive number sense. So I'm going to conclude by, again, coming back to this question. What do babies and young kids think about when they think about math? And what I hope I've convinced you of today is that they actually think quite a lot, though only approximately and intuitively. I also hope that this gives you a kind of permission to think about math, not as this sort of domain of, just following routines and getting to one right answer, but instead as a space for exploration, for play and engagement. And finally, that we can really foster it quite a lot with a smaller focus on preventing mistakes and a much more readily embrace of sort of pointing it out in the world around us. Now, before I open it up for questions, I just want to do two more very quick things. One, I want to first begin by saying that none of the research that you saw today would be possible without families like yours. Every single data point that you saw today, every bit of knowledge that we've acquired because families have chosen to spend their time with us doing these experiments. Normally during the year by coming on campus and doing them, but during COVID right now, more than ever, by doing studies with us online. And it's actually now more than ever that we need more families to continue being engaged with this research. It is the only way in which we're ultimately going to be able to figure out why and how to make children's lives better in general, beyond just mathematics itself. So as part of the EDRG, if you are interested in participating in any of these studies, including many of the ones that I've described today, including especially the ones where we're trying to really push the envelope of understanding this, we really encourage you to consider following this link, signing up, telling your friends about it. All of our studies are disguised as fun little games. They take usually 20 to 30 minutes at most. And right now during COVID, you can also do them online from the comfort of your home. The other thing I want to note, we, as Sav earlier said, this is a series of talks. The next talk that is going to be happening is going to be by Andrew Barron, who's going to be telling you about how kids think about social dominance. And his talk is scheduled for June 19th. You can register for it over on that link. And just like with mine, it will be recorded and posted online as well. So with that, I really want to thank you again for spending your Saturday with us, and I will open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Darko. That was fantastic. So again, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions there, and you can also vote for questions that you find interesting. So we've got one to kick us off already. To what extent do genetic or evolutionary factors affect an infant's number sense?
Wonderful question. The answer is that much less for genetics than we actually initially expected. When researchers first identified the number sense, I think a lot of the early researchers really thought that there must be a strong genetic role, right? That's the way in which psychologists very often approach these abilities that we think have an evolutionary basis. But it turns out that while there are these large individual differences between children and even adults in their intuitive number sense, genes play a surprisingly small role. The way we know that, by the way, is by looking at twins. So twins who share 100% of their, identical twins, I should say, who share 100% of their genes are about as correlated in their intuitive number sense as siblings who only share 50%. And so while there is some role for genes, it turns out to be very small. Now, that means that there are many environmental influences that matter a lot more for your number sense. We don't yet know what those are. It's one of the topics, for example, that my lab is very actively researching. And so ultimately, researchers, we don't yet know what are these non-genetic components. But yeah, I think to a somewhat surprising degree, the variability in the intuitive number sense is much less due to genes than I think researchers initially anticipated.
Awesome. The second question was pretty much the same thing. So is someone with a strong number sense more likely to have children with a strong number sense as well?
So that's interesting because it's actually, although you might initially think that it's the same question, it's not.
Well, good.
Because even though it is the case that the genetic component of the number sense is quite low, it is the case that parents with a stronger number sense do have kids who have a stronger number sense too. But the reason we think that is happening is not because of the genes, but because parents with a better number sense also tend to be parents who are less math anxious and who naturally tend to engage in more math talk with their kids. And so we actually suspect that the driver of that tight correlation between parents and kids is not necessarily their shared genes at all, but instead the environment that the parents are creating from the fact that they are just more comfortable with the idea of engaging in mathematics with their kids. And so again, I think it really highlights the importance of math talk at the home, more so than being sort of worried about if you are somebody who did bad at math, does it mean that your kid is doomed as well? No, not at all, right? It is a much more flexible and fluid system than even researchers expected.
Fantastic. This is a great question. How are some of the limitations of online studies avoided today and in the EDRG especially?
Yeah, great question. So I will say there are things that we are, as a result of moving to online, not able to avoid. There are particular tools that we use in my lab and other labs that have sadly just become completely inaccessible. In my lab, for example, we do a lot of work with using cameras just to look at where kids are looking, because that allows us to get a sense, it's just like, for example, those newborns, when you play a lot, when you play a matching number of tones, you want to know where they're looking at. These kinds of things cannot be done with web cameras. Other labs as well have unfortunately had to momentarily pause particular things. But in terms of how we successfully do this, I've actually been quite surprised at how robustly we've been able to continue our work online. I think a lot of researchers, when it first started, we were in panic mode, thinking like, oh, it's never going to translate very well to home. But it's actually been quite okay. The way that we do it is normally when parents come into the lab, they are, greeted, and there's a research assistant, a lab member who ends up administering the task in a very playful way. Now we do it over Zoom. So parents contact us, and we find a time that it works for them and their little one in order to schedule a time where we can have, a 30-minute little Zoom session. And what we often do in many of the labs is either there is a website that the parent can go to, and then all of these little games are shown in the browser. Or in some situations, we might actually, do live things on camera while the child is looking. And so it's still a very personal experience and very much tailored to the individual child and to your individual needs. And so it's not just some sort of a, automated system. In some cases, there are options for that as well. You should know if you're interested in that. But yeah, we do it with you live over Zoom most of the time.
Fantastic. And some of the other labs are the automated thing Darko was mentioning, are using this platform called Look It. It's a platform hosted by MIT. Anyone can sign up for a Look It and check out the studies that are there. And they're kind of neat because you can participate anytime, just from home. And we use the webcam to look at your child's responses, and we code it later. So the researcher's not there with you. You really can just do it whenever works for you. And so pros and cons for both types. And depending on the study, we're using the platform that works best. And the way that you would hear about those studies is to sign up for our database of families, and then our research assistants are trained to identify those families that match to a study and to reach out to you. So if you get yourself signed up through the EDRG website, then we will reach out each and every time there's a study for you. Yep. Okay, I have another great question, Darko. Just looking for a bit of a clarification about this math talk idea. Can you clarify, so the child's answer isn't so much important, it's more of how the child tries to answer?
That's absolutely right. So the point is not to focus on getting kids to necessarily answer right. And I think this is a very important thing. When the number sense is engaged, it's not always going to give you a right answer. Sometimes 15 dots you're going to see and you're going to say 10. That's okay. It's the conceptual engagement that we're really after. It's the, natural propensity to just start paying attention and noticing things in the world. And a lot of the time, parents are very naturally, it's not a surprise given how we're all taught math in school, really focused on sort of like giving a lot of corrective feedback when their kids are getting things wrong in math. And a lot of the times that can sometimes increase anxiety, increase worry, and make children a little bit more disengaged, make the parent worry as well. Whereas, if we're just sort of engaging with it, I think that, again, it's a space for exploration. It's a space for play, and when we play other kinds of games, when kids are building Legos, when, you're having a tea party or something like that, they're not always gonna, do the right thing. And we, in those cases, embrace it. And I'd want to encourage you to think about math as that kind of a tool for engagement with your children as well.
Fantastic. And we have two questions kind of related. So one, asking how volunteers can get involved, even those without children. And then the other asking specifically about undergraduate involvement. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do them both under one umbrella. So all of our labs, not just mine, very heavily involve undergraduates and often non-undergraduate students as well. We often have volunteer positions. We often have paid positions as well. It varies quite a bit from year to year what's available. But my advice for anybody who is thinking of getting involved with the research side of things is to go to our website, edrg.psych.ubc.ca. You can check out a list of all of the different centers. Mine is just one of them, and take a look at the different kind of work we do. And if you need a quick introduction, you can watch all of the Wonder Kid talks as well. And if there's a particular lab that does research that especially appeals to you, I would consider contacting their lab coordinator or lab manager sometimes and just ask what kind of opportunities exist. For most of our labs, I should note, most of the opportunities really come up usually around September. We're very often tied to a school year and the pace of when we are getting new volunteers, but that's not always true. Sometimes we're, suddenly need more all of a sudden. And many of the labs, mine included, tend to, if we don't have anything for you available right now, we tend to keep a little list if you're interested and contact you when we do. So I think that's the best that I can recommend. Take a look at different labs and contact the one that you think, or one or two or three that you think you'd be most interested in.
Awesome. If you're able to comment at all on using this math talk method for working with children with autism.
Great. So I'll begin by noting I'm not a clinical psychologist, and none of my research directly engages with clinical populations. I do know that there is a lot of interest in trying to figure out how to increase math talk in children with autism. It presents a lot of challenges in no small part because children diagnosed with autism are extremely variable in the severity of their symptoms. I think that the most recent work that I know is that it can be effective in children, especially who are a little bit lower on the spectrum. For children who are, experiencing a lot of more general issues with language and social processing and engagement in general, it's a lot harder. There are other kinds of apps that are being developed, and here I want to be cautious because they're not always free, and they very often, I think, capitalize on selling you products, not always under the guise of best research practices, but there are other software that tries to engage in math talk without a parent present. So, if you look online, you will find many other apps that sort of try to allow the child to sort of just do it on their own. I know that there have been some attempts to mobilizing that kind of thing for children who especially suffer from a lot of social issues as a result of their ASD diagnosis. But it's really a research area that we don't know a lot about, and I'd love to know more, but it's still very early days for that part of the research program.
All right, that was the last question we had submitted. That was great. Thank you so much, Darko. It was a fantastic talk and great question period.
Yeah, thank you all for your questions. Really appreciated all of them.
Yeah, fantastic questions. So we will get this talk posted, and we will also send out a reminder about the next talk in June. And thanks again for coming. And I hope you get to go out and enjoy some of the sun today if you happen to be in Vancouver. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Portia. And thank you, Dr. Odic.
Bye, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us.